Welcome everyone. So good to be learning together again. Today's class is Conversations on the Parashah. Each week we have different members from Drisha's learning community. This week we're welcoming Rabbanit Leah Sarna and Dr. Ethan Schwartz. Just a few words about Rabbanit Leah Sarna and Dr. Ethan Schwartz. Rabbanit Sarna is a member of Drisha's faculty and our director of team programs. And her husband, Dr. Ethan Schwartz, is a professor of Hebrew Bible at, I believe, Villanova University. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And with that, I'll turn this to both of you.
Thanks. I should also mention that Dr. Schwartz teaches at the Drisha Summer High School program. And one of the best moments when he was there 2 summers ago was that the students were late on Thursday night. They kind of came over to Dr. Schwartz and said, can you teach us biblical grammar, please? And that was, I think, the best moment of his life. So he's not only my spouse, but also a member of our faculty intermittently. And grateful that you said yes to joining me here today. So when Dr. Schwartz and I were talking about what we should talk about today, because Parashat Mishpatim is just sort of so rich and so full of different exciting, interesting kind of legal codes, but then we also have this little bit of narrative at the end. And you can actually, hopefully we'll send it out with the Drisha weekly email. Rabbi Silber has a great read about how that narrative in Exodus 24 kind of fits into what had happened previously and kind of how it all fits together. But we were talking about what to speak about today. And one of the things that Dr. Schwartz said was, there's this interesting piece where the law starts to sound like prophecy. And what Evie then mentioned in his introduction is that Ethan is primarily kind of a prophecy scholar. And so that's what we ended up choosing. We're going to be focusing on Exodus 22, approximately verses 20 to 23, but we'll talk about what comes before and what comes a little bit after. So Dr. Schwartz, do you wanna maybe introduce those psukim, read them, translate?
Yeah. Should I read them in Hebrew and first, and then is that okay? All right, and then I'll also, let me just pull up here the just if people are following along with the JPS translation. I would guess that would be the most common one people would have lying around. So let me just, so we're all looking at the same words in English, I'll pull that up instead of just translating on the fly here. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to read 20 to 23, but again, as mentioned, we will talk about kind of the surrounding passages as well. So. All right. So v'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzenu ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. I'll just read the whole thing through in Hebrew and then in English. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun im aneh ta'aneh oto ki imtza'o kitzak elai shamoa eshma tzakato v'chara api v'haragti etchem v'charev hayu neshechem almanot u'bnechem yatomim. So in the JPS, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me. And my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans.
And this is not the only time in the Torah, let alone in kind of the whole canon of Tanakh, that this idea of protecting the widow and orphan appears. So in Devarim, we even have it twice. So in Devarim 24, we have particularly vis-a-vis the judicial system, which is actually not clear. In our verses here, we're really talking to everyone. And in Devarim 24, we're talking specifically about the judicial system. Lo ta'ata mishpat ger yatom v'lo tachvo beged almana. You shall not subvert the kind of legal rights of the stranger or the fatherless. You shall not take a widow's garment in pawn. And then we have it also later on, Devarim 27, Arur mateh mishpat ger yatom v'almana. Cursed be the one who subverts the rights of the stranger the fatherless, and the widow. So now we've seen 3 times this kind of triumvirate of ger, yatom, almana, the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow and the orphan. Is there what are we supposed to make of that, like, threesome?
Yeah, so the interesting thing here is that the ger, the stranger, the resident alien, however you want to translate that, is a little bit of an outlier conceptually, but also if you look at the comparative evidence from elsewhere in the ancient world. So to start off with the similarities that are common to all 3, these are 3 paradigmatic cases of disenfranchised people. The ger, the stranger, is an outsider, right? Is not part of the kind of local ethnic native group, and the widow and the orphan, and as Leah just mentioned, orphan, yatom, is really better translated fatherless for reasons that will become clear in just a second, right? Both of them, what they have in common is that they lack an adult male advocate. The widow has no husband anymore, and the child without a father, right, has no father. And this matters because in the ancient world, in a patriarchal society, it was very important to have such an adult male advocate, and the people who did not were especially vulnerable to exploitation. So all 3 of those are vulnerable in that way, but the yatom and the almana, the orphan and the widow, share the specific reason why they're vulnerable. And then what's interesting is that when you look at the comparative material from other legal codes and other kinds of literature from the ancient Near East, you see, and we'll look at some examples in a little bit, you see a lot of the yatom and the almana showing up. You see a lot of language about protecting widows and orphans, but the ger question is something that seems to be more particular to Israel and to Tanakh. So that's a big conversation in thinking about the Bible in its ancient setting. Why do we have this actually quite unusual concern with this one class, when the other ways that the Bible tends to talk about social justice actually are very consistent with what we see elsewhere in the region? But I think in terms of thinking broadly about those 3, that would be the common factor here. These are three social classes that are especially vulnerable to exploitation by the powerful.
Yeah, and one thing that I know we mentioned, like, oh, these are the core verses that we're going to be talking about, but let's kind of go up one verse earlier to verse 19, which is Zoveach Lalohim Yacharam Biltila Hasham Vado. Whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord alone shall be proscribed. So we have this prohibition on foreign worship, and then that is immediately followed by the ger lo tonav lo tanachatzanu, right? You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him. And so I think there's quite a bit that could potentially be made of that juxtaposition. My grandfather, Professor Nachum Sarna, wrote a commentary to the book of Shmot, and for those of you who've been in these conversations so far, I feel like I've never failed to kind of bring him in, and why start now? So he suggests that, here I'm just going to quote, they serve to inculcate the idea that the rejection of the non-Israelite religious practices has no bearing on the inalienable right of the alien to civilized treatment free of victimization. So I think it points, what he's saying, what my grandfather says, is on the one hand, we have this prohibition on foreign worship, and that might make you think, anyone who does foreign worship, we can be awful to them, we can victimize them, we can oppress them. And so these 2 verses together of, on the one hand, right, whoever sacrifices to a god other than Hashem alone shall be proscribed, and on the other hand, But just because someone does that doesn't mean you can oppress them. Gives this very strong kind of moral opening to then say, and now let's look inwards to even within our own community. So what I maybe want to suggest is that within the text itself, there is a little bit of a difference between the ger, the resident alien, and the fatherless and the husbandless, I guess, the yatom almana. But that actually, like, the ger is in some ways like the most complicated case, because maybe we could say that the ger does like kind of like bad things or sinful things, and therefore we have some sort of like on-ramp towards oppressing them. And no, even the ger who maybe doesn't worship Hashem shouldn't be victimized, let alone kind of call the Homer people within our own community. And then from the ger we move on to talking about the widow and the orphan.
So I think we like in terms of unpacking that, it might be useful to just back up one step and think about what it means in general in terms of the text that these two laws are juxtaposed in this way, because there's something interesting going on here. If you look, and this might be tricky depending on what printing of Tanakh you're looking at, especially if you're looking in a translation, it might not be as clear. But so the Masoretic text of the Bible, the authoritative Jewish version of the Bible will indicate various kinds of breaks in the text, right? Parashot, which are not how we normally think of a parsha, like Parashat Mishpatim, but these kind of like, the equivalent of kind of paragraph breaks, essentially. And there's two kinds. There's the inline break, which is marked by a samech, right, stuma, and then there's the next line break, like what we think of as a new paragraph, and that's marked with a pei, a ptucha. These are all over Parashat Mishpatim because they are used to distinguish different laws or different clusters of laws. So you might have one cluster of law that deals with a particular theme, and those are all contained within one parasha, and then you switch topics and you have a break, right? So a big question in the scholarship on this material is, what is the logic for the way that these laws are presented? Is there a rhyme and reason to the ordering? And what is really striking about this particular section is that this prohibition on worship of foreign gods comes not just immediately before the discussion of exploitation of these vulnerable classes, but actually there is no parashah between them, right? And fascinatingly, so I'm looking in the standard academic, critical edition of the Bible, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, BHS, and they put in their own paragraph break after that verse, as if to say, oh, like, we're switching topics here, but it's actually not in the Masorah, right? There is no, and they acknowledge it because they print. If there's a stuma, they print a samech. If there's a ptucha, they print a pei, and it's actually, there's nothing there, right? Because there is no break. So what that suggests is that at least in our Masoretic version of the Torah, that prohibition on idolatry, on worship of other gods, whatever you want to call it, is actually treated in the same cluster as these laws about oppression. So one reading is the one that we just heard, Nachum Sarna's reading, that this is saying you can't worship other gods, but don't let that cause you to conclude that therefore you can oppress the people who do worship other gods, right? Something else, I don't know if he talks about that. I don't have that commentary in front of me, but you'll note that in verse 20, if you're looking in the Hebrew, it starts with a connective. It starts with a vav, right? Which can sometimes function, right, as a contrastive conjunction, a but, as opposed to an and, the way we normally think about it, certainly in modern Hebrew. So you could almost potentially read it as those who worship, or the one who worships other gods. We're just going to put the word other in there. It's not actually printed there, which is very weird. But those who worship other gods will be prescribed, that, i.e., except for Hashem himself. But, right, but you can't oppress the ger, right? So that is one reading. Another possibility which isn't necessarily mutually exclusive, but this would be the one that I would more intuitively go to. That the idea that it was linked specifically with the ger had not occurred to me, but is to see it being linked with the whole discussion of the prohibition on exploiting these vulnerable classes, and to say that there's actually a kind of fundamental link between this concern with social justice and like the fundamental principles of exclusive worship of the God of Israel, right? That there's a way in which not oppressing these vulnerable classes, not exploiting them, or sorry, let me put that differently. That yes, exploiting them is an expression of idolatry, right? Now, that might be just like a midrash on the text. I can't say for sure, but it is quite conspicuous that you don't have a parashah between those two lines. And that to me suggests that maybe it is a midrash, but it's a midrash that's kind of baked into the way the Masoretic text has been formulated. We don't know if those how far back those breaks go, right? They, as far as we have evidence for, they go to the Middle Ages, right? But that might well be continuing traditions that are older, so there is something in the text to make that claim.
I was going to take the conversation a little bit somewhere else, but is now the right place to talk about Hammurabi or not yet?
We could, yeah, sure, okay. Whatever you want.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, just to, this we already talked a little bit about ancient Near Eastern context, so I guess we can just like quickly come back to this, but and it also does have to do with the juxtaposition of some of these laws in a way. But so this section of the Torah, right, Parashat Mishpatim, what scholars usually call the covenant code, for a long time has been compared with the laws of Hammurabi, which one of the most famous Mesopotamian texts, right? Early second millennium BCE legal code, and there are direct correspondences. And in Hammurabi, we don't have, as far as I am aware, we don't have a law that's specific. Like in the law part, we don't have a law that specifically links the widow and the orphan. But actually, at the end, there's an epilogue where Hammurabi talks about how great he is, because oh look, like I receive these just perfect laws from the gods, and I am I am in my wisdom and graciousness implementing them so that our city can prosper. Like it's like this was very common in these ancient Near Eastern law codes, that kind of like piece of royal propaganda. If you think about it, we have equivalents of that in the Torah. It's just the king is God, right? The king is God himself as opposed to the human king. Whereas in the Mesopotamian and other ancient Near Eastern ones, the human king is kind of a representative of the divine realm. But in any case, we have this epilogue, and one of the things that Hammurabi says to show how great he is that he has safeguarded the welfare of widows and orphans, and it's that exact same pairing. So this does seem to have been a stock phrase, a kind of catch-all to talk about the most vulnerable members of society in the ancient Near East, right? It's a double in the same way that, like, you can plausibly translate Shamayim va'aretz, heaven and earth, as not meaning literally the heaven and the earth, but like everything that exists, heavens, earth, everything in between, right? You can sort of think about widows and orphans similarly. It's not too extreme, so the parallel doesn't work precisely, but it's like a stock phrase that actually indicates a much larger group. So it's not saying, oh, literally just don't oppress widows and orphans, but other vulnerable classes are fine. No, it means like these are the oppressed of the oppressed, but everyone else applies too. So we don't have a direct legal equivalent, again, as far as I am aware, within the law portion of the laws of Hammurabi, but that pairing does show up in the epilogue in an interesting way. And again, there are equivalents with the way that God is described as someone. I mean, right here in this text, God is someone who is especially concerned with the plight of widows and orphans. Right, this shows up again in Deuteronomy chapter 10. So as a description of God. quick note, though, just about a law. I was going to say this very, very quickly because we also didn't include this, unfortunately, on the sources that were sent around. But there is a law in the laws of Hammurabi that deals with widows and orphans in a way, because it doesn't combine them in quite the same sort of stereotypical language, but it's talking about what happens when a widow seems to be remarries, and what's going to happen to the property from her deceased husband if her children are still young. And it's kind of it sort of sets up this legal process through which to ensure that her children from the previous marriage don't just kind of get cut out of the picture and totally disinherited by the new family that she's joining. So there's kind of a simultaneous concern there for both widows and orphans. And again, you see that like widows and orphans are two sides of the same coin in this patriarchal society, because they both, like, when a father dies, a widow and a yatom, a fatherless, is produced as a result of that. So you do have a law that is concerned with safeguarding the children from the deceased father in terms of their inheritance. And what's interesting there is a specific reference to silver in that context, direct cognate in Akkadian with Hebrew kesef, right? It's the same word. And you notice that if you look at verse 24, after this text about not oppressing widows and orphans, we immediately switch to a conversation about crediting and taxes and stuff. But the very first word there is kesef, right? So it's intriguing. Now there, to be clear, we do have a Parashah Tucha, right? If you're looking at a Hebrew text of Tanakh, you'll see that after verse 23, there's a little pay, or maybe even they do put in the paragraph break fully. But it is tempting to think about, you have the juxtaposition of this concern with widows and orphans, and then a mention of silver and something about money. And then if you look at Hammurabi, and that's actually like they're thinking about money in that context, because the whole question is making sure that they're that the inheritance is protected. So that's a potential logic for why these laws here are ordered in the same way.
Yeah, so I want to transition in a second, like from there to what the Ramban, which is on the source sheet that was sent out, has to say, because I think it's actually ties in really interestingly to like the punishment piece of what we see in the Torah here. But if anyone, I just wanted to say before I go there that if anyone has questions, feel free to either throw them into the chat or like do the little like hand raise button, and otherwise we could just keep talking kind of indefinitely. So we'll just do that unless someone kind of jumps in. So definitely anyone who's here should feel free, and Evie will also be the conduit for anyone who's watching this live who posts on Facebook or something like that. So I just wanted to kind of mention how we'll be running it like that. But anyway, so we dropped a source sheet into the chat, and one of the sources on there, one of the first ones, is the Ramban on our pasuk. So just to review, right? If you oppress the widow and the orphan, then v'charav, my anger will blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children shall become orphans. And one of the things that the Ramban points out is that this is a little bit strange, because we have a list in Sanhedrin 83a of chayavei mitot b'yadei shamayim, people who it should be kind of getting death by the hand of heaven. So I brought that Gemara for you also in Sanhedrin 83a. Gemara cites a Tosefta. These are they who are liable to receive death at the hands of heaven. The elu shavamita, and then the list is people who eat tevel, people who eat untithed produce, and impure kohen who eats truma. Like, it's all kind of that stuff. And nowhere on this list do you see someone who oppressed the widow and the orphan, even though literally in the pasuk it says v'charav hi v'harag tiachan v'charav. So the Ramban has a problem, obviously, which is like, how do you square that to Sefta with our pasuk, which makes it seem like God's going to punish that person, and not just it's wrong and courts should punish that person, but actually like God's self is going to rain down that punishment. So here's the Ramban, He says, the reason is that it doesn't actually belong on that list. Says the Ramban, it's different. It shouldn't be on the list. Because Onesh Bekan She'arigutam Becharev Oyev O B'milchama, right? The punishment here is that the person who oppressed the widow or the orphan will be killed by the sword of the enemy, or in war below Huda. That's the important thing. And they're not going to know. They're not going to have the body. They're not going to know that the man was killed. V'hayu neshehem almanut le'olam. And therefore the wives will become agunot. So you thought it was bad to just be a widow of the type who could remarry, and then we see for Hammurabi that her belongings get protected and get then passed down to the orphan, and the Torah has some similar protections for the children of women who remarried and all of that. And who doesn't get those protections? If you mistreated the widow and the orphan, your spouse will be an agunah, and she will not get any of those protections. That's here you see kind of like igun as like divine punishment in a way that, like, again, this Ramban is really complicated, but I always like to point out places where we see igun as like inescapable divine punishment and not like punishment by Bate Den who refused to intervene, and punishment for like an extraordinarily unethical thing that was done. So that's the Ramban of like this type of activity is extraordinarily unethical. And Ethan, I'll have you chime in a second. But I want to then look differently though at the Chizkuni. Because the Chizkuni says, Mitzvah zo k'tuva b'lashon rabim, ma she'ein kein b'kol hadinim haktuvim b'parsha zo. Says this mitzvah is written in the plural. I'm on page 4 if you're in the source sheet, by the way. This mitzvah is written in the plural, and that's actually kind of unusual in this what Bible scholars would call the covenant code, like in this section of the Parashah Mishpatim. That's unusual. Chizkuni says, "Lefi shekulam poshim bam," because this is something that everyone does. So on the one hand, you have the Ramban saying, this is such an extremely terrible thing that if you do it, God will not only kill you, but he'll make your wife an agunah, and your children will be fatherless forever. And then says the Chizkuni, it's written in the plural because it's inevitable. Everybody does this. And here's how you do it. Afilu tam she'enam maknitim, even the people who they're not like they're not kind of going out and doing it explicitly. But you're complicit in the oppression of the widow and the orphan, even if you're just a bystander. You witness exploitation and you do not protest it. You are included in the plural of this pasuk, which is pretty incredible. And I think we can hold both of those. Meaning, I think, on their face, the Ramban and Chizkuni seem to be kind of disagreeing with each other, where the Ramban saying this is a super evil thing to do, and there's like this really clear, direct punishment, which is obviously a great reading of the Psukim. And then you have the Chizkuni who's saying, well, that seems really extreme for something that literally everyone does. I don't know, Ethan, if you want to hop in on that idea for a second.
Well, I would just say that it's worth noting that this is that in this section we have a switch from the general mode of Parashat Mishpatim up until this point, which is almost entirely if-then laws, right? Like what people often call casuistic laws. So, like, if this situation obtains, or then you do this, right? The very first and in some ways most famous law, because it's the first one of the Parashah, right? Ki tikneh eved ivri. Like when you acquire a Hebrew slave, in that situation, then the following applies. But it's not necessarily a universal situation. It's like if this initial condition happens, then it triggers everything that follows, right? And you can understand why, even though it's law and it's meant to apply to large numbers of people, that those kind of situational laws would make more sense to talk about the individual basis, because you're talking about address individual people in the singular, because you're talking about individual cases. And then it's interesting that in this section of the Parsha, we get a switch to what's often called apodictic law, which is just like, this, do this. Like it's not a conditional. It doesn't obtain in certain situations, right? And that's that's what we get right with V'ger lo toneh, right? The zoveach le'elohim parentheses acherim yochoram is a little more complicated, because that participle at the beginning, the zoveach, I think could be interpreted as like, when someone does this, they should be prescribed. So that one's a little iffy grammatically. But then we switch to the law about the ger, and also the almanan yatom in verse 21, where we get just these firm statements of, you don't do this, right? It's not tied to a specific situation, and in that sense, relating to. I think Chizkuni was right. Chizkuni was you did him second, right? Ramban was first.
Yeah, lefisha kulam pushim ba'am. That's
yeah. So you can understand that in that relief too, about like the switch from conditional cases to just kind of general principles.
And I think that's why you were saying, when we were kind of selecting this, I said this in the introduction a little bit. You said, like, you read this to someone and you said, and without any context, and said to them, where in Tanakh is this to be found?
Yeah.
They wouldn't normally say Parashat Mishpatim. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So context is important here, right? So I teach biblical studies at a Catholic university, and my research is a lot about prophetic social critique. So passages in prophets where the prophets are speaking out on behalf of these vulnerable classes of society, right? And kind of indicting the powerful for failing to protect them at a minimum, and sometimes indicting the powerful for outright exploiting them in the first place, right? Just a good famous example, one that I work with a lot, is the Haftarah for Shabbat Chazon, the Haftarah from the beginning of the book of Isaiah, right? Where Isaiah, or God really speaking through Isaiah, utterly lambasts the people for their, what God experiences as these vain, insulting sacrifices, while, they're offering up all these sacrifices to God while failing to provide for, these socioeconomically disadvantaged classes. And the kind of capstone of the indictment, right, in verse 17, God says, when he's saying, I don't want the sacrifices, here's what I do want you to do, like the final, like culminating, injunction there is shiftu yatom rivu almana, right? Execute justice for the orphan and plead the case of the widow, right? So, in my teaching on this in a Christian context, right, I've done this a few times where without providing any citations, I give them these lines from Parashat Mishpatim, and I ask them, like, what book of the Bible is this from? And almost always, people will say Isaiah or Amos, right? They almost always think it's from the prophets, because there's this deeply entrenched idea within our broader American culture that flows directly from Christianity, that the voices of justice, especially socioeconomic justice in Tanakh, in the Bible, are the prophets, right? And the enemy is actually the law, right? That the law is oppressive. The law is what kind of enshrines this exploitation, and it's the prophets, in terms of speaking out against these institutions and this power, right? They are the defenders of justice. And so what is so fascinating about a line like this is that not only is it a legal provision for protection for the vulnerable in exactly the way that the prophets are advocating for, but it's voiced as God speaking in this kind of passionate prophetic way in the midst of a law code. We haven't talked about the doubling of the verbs here, the use of the infinitive absolute. But so listen very carefully in Hebrew to the second part of the Yatom and Almanah section, right? This is verse 22. Im aneh te'aneh, right? You've got aneh te'aneh, tza'ok, yitz'ak, shamoa, eshma, right? All three of those verbs are doubled, quote unquote. It's a grammatical construction using this form, the infinitive absolute, in conjunction with the finite verb. So this can do a lot of different things in terms of meaning within biblical Hebrew. And there is debate about what the doubling function is here. But I would say my best read of it is that it imbues the whole thing with a sense of urgency and intensity, and that God is speaking very, very passionately here. And it's fascinating. And this is the kind of thing that often tricks people, especially coming from a Christian lens, into thinking that this is from a prophetic text, that it's about justice and it's very passionate, right? And I think it's worth reflecting on what it means that this is baked into a law code. I think this is an important thing we should think about as Jews reading this in a broader Christian culture. This is a major rebuke to the Christian caricature of Judaism as this legalistic religion that is not concerned with justice and actually often is on the side of oppression, right? That here, not only do you have a law that is providing for socioeconomic justice, but it's imbued with this passionate indictment from God. But it's not prophecy, right? It's God's. It's God building this into the vision for society. And I always emphasize to my students, like, at the end of the day, like, you can have all the prophetic social critics you want, right? You can have people speaking out against injustice, but the end goal has to be a legal vision for how the society is going to be structured to provide injustice, provide for justice, right? So what this text is doing is, in some sense, more radical than the prophetic text, because it actually has a chance of being effective, right? It says we're going to lay this down into the way the society is structured, right? And there's lots of examples of that throughout the Torah. The Jubilee, the Yovel is a very commonly cited example in terms of how that is envisioning a society built on certain principles of socioeconomic justice, instead of just standing in the streets shouting and screaming, which can be very powerful and can make for really good sermons and really powerful readings from the Haftarah. But at the end of the day, what do they really do to help anybody?
Yeah, the Kli Yakar points out, this is the last source on the source sheet. We're not going in order in case you haven't figured that out already. But he points to this doubling and has like a very beautiful, obviously midrashic kind of read on it. But he asked that same question. Right, it says im anot anet oto, if you will oppress him, if you will, like, oppressingly oppress him, and he says otam nubaile. Why does it say him in the singular? It should say them in the plural. And then he says, and furthermore, umahu hakafel anot anet saok yitzak shamoa eshma. What are all of these like doubled verbs? Asked the Kli Yakar. He says, we can say in a pshat way. Again, you can judge for yourself whether you think this is the pshat. But Jalif amim adam ma'anat hayatom levad. Sometimes you oppress the singular orphan. Ve'imo almana, and his mother, once he's fatherless, his mother then is a widow. And neharu'ut, she sees it, and she can't do anything to save her son. And by you just oppressed one of them, but really you oppressed her as well. So by one act of oppression, you've oppressed both. And that's the doubling, that then shneihem toakim, that then both of them are calling out, and Hashem actually hears both of them, and then the punishment comes doubled, that the punishment is both on the sons and on the children and on the wife are the wives, because even though you just oppressed one, the punishment is really on both, because the oppression of one is the oppression of the other. And then he adds in this other really beautiful thing. That was the pshat. So this is the altzad haremez. This is a I don't know, like a hidden meaning, maybe. He says, since God is the father of orphans, then that with all the suffering of orphans, God suffers alongside of them, the same way that when you oppress an orphan, the mother sees it and feels that same level of suffering. So when you oppress an orphan, God sees it, and then God feels that level of suffering as well. And that's maybe part of why you have the kind of the maybe like intensity that Ethan was describing, that really, because who is in fact screaming out? It's the orphan, says the Kliyakar, and God screaming out together. Right? That now the Kliyakar, this is the part that's maybe more like remezi. It kind of like divides God up into the midat hadin, like the element of mercy, and then you have God, the element of rachamim also. So you have the midat hadin calling out along with the orphan, and then you have midat harachamim. So God is now kind of divided into justice and mercy. So the justice side is calling out, but the mercy side of God, mekabel ta'akat shnehem, and the mercy side of God receives the calling out both from the orphan's mother, and the orphan's father, which is God's self as well. And so that may be in the Kliyakar's understanding of kind of what happens when someone oppresses the orphan, and how do you account for all of these doublings and all of this kind of intensity and like the twofoldness of this whole verse. The Kliyakar understands, because that's what starts to happen. You oppress an orphan, and the reverberations are extraordinary because of all of the people invested in that orphan's well-being and all the people who join into the orphan's cries. I think it's like a very kind of beautiful, Kliyakar. And at the same time, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to just transition back to that. It goes back to that tension, right? If we have a tension between the Chizkuni, who says everyone's always oppressing the orphan, and the Ramban, who says, and when you oppress the orphan, all these terrible things happen, and your wife will be an aguna. Certainly, it seems like the Kliyakar is on team Ramban. If we had to kind of like, if we're making teams, it's definitely the Ramban and the Kliyakar versus Chizkuni. But then you still have it, but it opens up all sorts of other questions, which is where I was about to transition to. But do you have anything to say about the Kliyakar now at the time?
Well, just on the general theme of the sort of divine passion and the idea of the link between the crying out and God's response, and how this is maybe challenges our expectations about both how we define law and prophecy, and suggest that those categories kind of constrict the way that we think about this. I also we've looked at what comes before, and I wanted to we paid a little bit of attention to what comes after with the kesef, but I wanted to just go a little bit further into that and just note. So you have this discussion of loans and credit, and then you have the idea of what happens when someone gives their garment as a pledge, and this commandment that you have to return. Someone gives their garment as a pledge, you have to return it to them at night, right?
And isn't there in the Israel Museum? There's like there's a record of that, right?
Yeah. So there's an inscription where this is referenced about someone taking a garment. It comes up in Amos, where there's a scene where it's talking about how corrupt and exploitative the leaders are, and it talks about how they're going to sleep at night in a garment that they've taken on pledge, right? Meaning that there's someone out there who is sleeping naked. But there's this moment in verse 26 and we don't have the same doubling of the verbs. We don't have this infinitive absolute construct, but there's a different way that this divine investment and passion is expressed.
You have doubling in 25, chavol, tachbol.
Right, yeah, that's true, but that's not about God's response, right? So,
right.
Yeah, and one of the things is that in these conditional, like this is some of the commentators, like the contemporary academic commentators discuss this, is that you do see some of these can be explained by that construct is often shows up in these conditional clauses, right? So for some of those you can explain it that way. It's maybe more interesting what's going on when it's talking about God's response. But in any case, if you look in verse 26, right? So it says previous verse says you need to return if someone pledges you their garment, you need to return it to them at night. And then it goes on to explain why. It's their only garment. It's their covering for their skin. With what else is he going to sleep? And so it's something that our shared teacher, Rabbi Shai Held, once pointed out to me is that he talks about this a lot when he's teaching this stuff. Is that question, it's like this exclamation from God that if you stop and think about it, sounds kind of funny in the middle of a law code, because it's not an injunction, it's not a rule. It's like God thinking out loud, being like, this is why you have to do this, because for God's sake, as it were, what else is he going to sleep with, right? And you can almost and this idea that this is a question, but there's obviously no punctuation in Tanakh, but this idea that it's a question goes all the way back. Like you can see this reflected in the way it's translated already in antiquity, so you have continuing, right? It's the same theme that we have in the passages we've been focusing on, in terms of it's an issue of socioeconomic justice, and you still have this like very vivid divine investment in the matter, right? Literally getting worked up about it, and that is something that is often stereotypically associated with prophecy, and it's worth thinking about what it means that it's in a law code, and again, like how this should maybe force us to expand our thinking about maybe these boundaries shouldn't be as firm. So that's just another example of that in the same overall section.
Yeah, thanks. I want to look at the Mechilta, which I brought on it's on page 4, and I brought it after the Chizkuni because I feel like we've seen a lot of stuff that's in the direction of the like, this is so terrible. It's like this massive kind of affront to God. And then on the flip side, we have the Chizkuni, who's just like, everyone hurts these people. Everyone sins against these people. And so I wanted to bring this story about Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shimon. So we're in the Mechilta. It's like the second, the paragraph divisions are my paragraph divisions. But if you're on the source sheet, you get to benefit from my paragraph divisions. So Kvar Haya Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Shimon, Yotzim lehareg, so they're going out to be executed. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon le Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi, libi utashe'ini yodea alma ani meharag. Rabbi, my heart is faint, for I don't understand why this is happening to me. I don't understand why I am being killed. And Rabbi Ishmael replies, Amar lo Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Shimon, Mi'amacha ba'adam etzach aladin o she'elav akavto ad sheteh shotat kosacha ve'noel sandalacha or teif talitacha. Did anyone ever come to you for judgment or ruling, and you kept him waiting until you had finished your cup, or you had taken off your shoes, or you had put on your clothes, or you had put on your garment? Amra Torah im anota ana echad inui merubah ve'echad inui mu'at. So he says, the pasuk says, do not, if afflictingly you afflict, whether a great affliction or a small affliction. So, and then Rabbi Shimon replies, Amar lo nichamtani, Rabbi, you have consoled me, Rabbi. So these two great rabbis, Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shimon, are going out to be killed by the Romans. And Rabbi Shimon says, I just can't, I have to be able to understand, like, what did I do wrong that this is happening to me? And Rabbi Ishmael says to him, I know what you did wrong. You afflicted a widow and orphan. You made them wait until you got comfortable. And that is enough. Any level of affliction, the tiniest level of affliction, is enough to account for you, is enough to kind of be in violation of these laws. And therefore, God is killing you in more or less. It's a fulfillment of something between prophecy and promise and command. And I think that's the other piece of it that kind of like smells of prophecy, is that it's not like, and then this, we started earlier on with this, right? In the Ramban, we saw this. It's not that you'll be killed by God in like a justice situation, or you'll be killed by the court. It's like, this thing is going to happen and you're going to get killed by it. Like, you're going to get killed. You're going to get killed by the sword. And the Ramban understands that to be like the sword of the other. And this story also, right? Like, who is God acting through here? Like, God is acting through the Roman oppressors of these rabbis, in at least Rabbi Ishmael's understanding. So I do think that like the way that the justice is brought about, I think also gives it this kind of like prophecy feeling to it, in a way. But I would also say that it's a way of kind of almost like making sense of the world for these rabbis. Like, yeah, there are some that are so extreme and they require of you such extraordinary sensitivity, and to such a high degree that you will by necessity fail. And that failure then can almost help us make sense of the world. Like, when bad things happen, as happened here to Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Ishmael, the strictness of the law and the intensity of the promised punishment for its infraction gives them an answer to theodicy, which is also pretty incredible in the story.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, it's a very, I want to say clever. I don't mean that in like a dismissive way. I mean in a genuine way. It's a very clever reading of the fact that this cherev, the sword, shows up here, because I didn't do an exhaustive search of this because I wasn't really paying attention to it when I was looking at some commentators, but to the best of my knowledge, I think the modern commentators mostly gloss over the sword as just an idiom. Like, oh yeah, like God is gonna strike the person down directly, which does seem to be the plain sense. And, oh, but what does it mean with a sword? It's like, oh, it's like that's how you talk about killing people, or it's metaphorical, or whatever. Obviously, we do have references to God's sword, right? In Isaiah, right? God is going to slay the dragon with his sword, and the sword outside the Garden of Eden. So the idea of God wielding a sword is not crazy. Right, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of references to a divine sword. So it's not impossible. It's not. I mean, I think that's probably is the pshat, that it is just an idiom. But the intimation that this might be God working through these kind of human oppressors is very clever, and especially in the context of the classical rabbinic, mapping this onto Rome. So yeah, that's a really nice close reading that I totally agree is kind of like turning this into a theodicy in a way, like an answer to the question of why people are suffering, the Jews specifically.
So I think in our last couple of minutes, I want to turn to one other question, which is, okay, so you have a widow and an orphan, and let's zoom into the orphan for a second. So he doesn't have a father. So, and you have to be extremely careful not to cause him any, don't even make him wait while you're putting your shoes on, like that level of, we don't want to cause any kind of suffering. Oh, Marian, I see you 1 second. We don't want to cause any kind of suffering to the orphan. But then how are you supposed to teach the orphan anything? And so I'll take the question from Marian, and then we're going to look at the Rambam's answer to that, because I think it's a very beautiful answer. You're muted, Marian.
Marian, just unmute first.
I'm not sure that it's a question so much as an observation from a different sort of source, which says justice delayed is justice denied. If you keep somebody waiting when they really can't wait, you've denied them justice. You may call it putting your shoes on, but that's not what it is to the person who's in desperate straits.
Sure. But one of the interesting things, we skipped it in the Ramban, but the first thing that the Ramban says is even a wealthy widow, which is to say, these people, this widow and this orphan, he actually has really nice language for it. Let me just open it back up to here. He says, "Afilu ashira ba'alat nechasim," even a wealthy widow, because her tears are frequent and her soul is depressed. So you might think, oh, this person, this widow, orphan, by all kind of objective measures, like they seem fine. And the Ramban says, no, categorically, their situation is such that they cannot suffer more. Like their mental health and their emotional situation is such that even if they have a million servants and all the wealth they could need or use in this lifetime, that's actually like not the reason why you're not allowed to oppress them. You're not allowed to oppress them in any way, cause them any kind of inconvenience or suffering, even in minor ways, because it's not about the stuff, it's about their like emotional state. So I think just adding to that, right, that the delay of justice, maybe, I think you said it more from like, well, they need this to be resolved. But even just the fact of waiting itself might cause an emotional strain that is then a denial of justice. I think that would be like an additional contribution to what you're saying. And I really appreciate the comment. Yeah.
I think it's worth noting also that like that bringing in of like the psychological state of these figures, right? That does, to the best of my knowledge, that does seem to be a kind of rabbinic innovation. I don't know of a place in the Torah or in Tanakh in general where it shows that is the act of concern, right? That the Bible itself does seem to see these social states as primarily about material, social status and the attendant, material concerns that come with that. So I might be wrong. There might be a place I'm not thinking of, but if I'm not wrong, then that's really interesting because then you do have this expansion of this category by later Jewish interpreters who are saying that actually the lowliness and the disenfranchisement and the difficulty of these positions is not purely monetary, right? It's not purely about their social status. You can even have a rich widow who can maybe fend for herself and is not really in danger, but like that's still a vulnerable person in a way because of her experience, and you need to respect that.
Yeah, so let's open to Maimonides because he says the same thing as the Ramban says. He says, "Chayav adam lizaher b'yatomim v'alma." I know that a person is obligated to be extremely careful with orphans and widows, mipnei shenafshan shvela leme'od, because their spirits are very low, verucham nemucha, af al pi shehen ba'alei mamon, even though they have wealth, afilu almanato shel melech v'yatomav, even the widow of a king and the king's fatherless children, who, by the way, are also called what once their father dies? The king. Right? The fatherless children of kings, at least one of them in a dynasty is a king themselves. Even with them, you have to be extremely careful. Because Shanamar kol manav yatom lo ta'anu. Right, that's our verse. Do not oppress all widows and orphans. And I'm skipping here, but I think I underlined where I'm going to if you're following along the sources. Barit krutalahan mishamar v'hayaolam. The one who spoke and the world was created also has a covenant with the widow and the orphan. Anytime they cry out because they have been wronged, they are answered. And so, but then that they cried out because they have been wronged. And that I mentioned before we turned to Marianne's question before, I mentioned that there's kind of a problem, which is like, how are you supposed to educate? You're not allowed to cause them any kind of suffering. I don't know any kid who went through school without any whining or complaining or challenges. And so what are you supposed to do? So this is the way Maimonides answers that question, which is to say, what are the cries that are heard? They are the cries that are heard because someone intended to kind of be oppressive. But inautam harav kedei lelamdan Torah o omanu o lahacham b'derech yishara harei zamutar. But if their teacher makes them suffer so that they can learn Torah or a craft, or to steer them on the correct path, says the Rambam, that is allowed. But but you shouldn't treat them like any other student. But you need to actually treat them differently, and which is very complicated, I'm sure. And with kindness and with extraordinary mercy and dignity, because we see in Proverbs 22, for God will take up their cause. So any teacher who's teaching an orphan needs to be extremely careful, because you know who you're answering to. You're not going to get a phone call from an angry parent. You're going to get a phone call from an angry HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then you're really in for it. So I think we're basically at time, but I definitely wanted to leave you with just to I'll summarize a little bit of my takeaways, and then Ethan, I'll turn over to you to summarize a little bit also. I'm very taken with this idea that kind of law and prophecy can go hand in hand and almost like be combined together, and that we see this when the law becomes impassioned, it starts to sound like prophecy and might even be in fact prophesying. You will do this, right? If you follow the Chizkuni and say it's almost like necessary that this will happen to you, but then also these horrible things will result of it, and then to see that in a law code is I think really complicated and really, really interesting. And then my grandfather lends really nice language to this, where he says, the Torah here enjoins sensitivity to their condition, not simply out of humanitarian considerations, but as a divine imperative. Insensitivity is consequently sinful, a violation of a commandment that expresses God's will. Insensitivity is sinful and wreaks these incredible then consequences. And I like my grandfather's choice of language of insensitivity, because then that, I think it really matches what we saw in all of these commentaries of how delicate it is. And how even the smallest thing, says Rabbi Yishmael to Rabbi Shimon and the Mechilta, you just made them wait. That's it. You were putting on your shoes, but now you're getting killed by the Romans. It's that level of not paying attention in one tiny way. And I think, how can a law, like, does that even make sense in a law? But it does make sense when it's law and prophecy kind of combined. And so I think that's like a very helpful way of making sense of legislated sensitivity that we're seeing here. And then I don't know if you want to say any kind of concluding, summarizing remarks.
Cosign, but yeah, just to emphasize once again, I do think that we can get really locked into these genre distinctions and to saying that something is inherently prophetic or something is inherently legal, and to state plainly that this is in large measure in our society a product of Christian ideas that were often formulated in direct opposition to Judaism, as critiques of Judaism. The idea that to describe someone who is pursuing justice as by definition prophetic, such that the justice just becomes the content, right, is very problematic. And it's just such a part of our culture that a lot of Jews do this instinctively as well. This law sounds prophetic. What sounds prophetic about it? They don't mean all the nuances we were talking about God's voice and the way that all that. They just mean it has to do with justice. And there's a lot of danger and harm in that, because there's so many anti-Jewish ideas wrapped up in that justice is the unique province of prophecy, right? And actually is not native to law. And so I think that a text like this is very fruitful for thinking about how we, in an American Jewish context, we have been acculturated to a lot of ways of thinking about this stuff that is shot through with implicit anti-Judaism. And I think that grappling with the way that a text like this challenges those categories can be really productive for articulating alternative and deeply Jewish accounts of what justice is over against those regnant concepts.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz, and thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today here on Zoom and also live on Facebook. With Rabbanit Sarna being with us, I just want to mention that our programs for high school and middle school girls are filling up, but there's still time to get your favorite Talmidot signed up for an amazing summer. So please look up the information on girls.drisha.org. We'd love to have you join. Thank you everyone again, and I hope to see you at more classes here at Drisha today, this week, next week, and always. להתראות.